Welcome to the Jason D'Souza Show. Join us as we explore the evolving urban landscape, uncovering the trends, stories, and innovations shaping our cities. Thanks for watching and enjoy today's episode.
Anthony Bubalo, welcome to the podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
So fascinating time to have you on the show. Lots to talk about. It seems the world is going into overdrive with the election of a second-term Trump administration. So who else but a geopolitical strategist to have on the show? So welcome. Before we get into it, I always want to ask, so you're the CEO of the Asia Society, which is a very well-respected international affairs think tank, I think we describe you as.
Let's call it a civil society organisation.
Civil society organisation. How very diplomatic.
We're a bit broader than a think tank.
Fair enough. How'd you get into it?
Asia Society itself?
How'd you get into what you do? Because when I first met you, you were at the Lowy Institute.
Yeah, so I was, I left university with a desire to get into a job in the international relations field. I did the obvious thing. I joined DFAT. So I was a DFAT officer for 13 years.
Were you?
Yeah.
I sat my DFAT exam in Tokyo.
Oh, there you go.
Because I was there on holiday.
Right.
It was a cool experience, actually. I didn't join DFAT, however.
Okay. So I had postings in the Middle East, had a couple of years in the Office of National Intelligence, and then when the Lowy Institute was established, I put my hand up for that and was part of the original team, partly because the thing I really liked doing was, the particularly geopolitical analysis. And you reach a point in DFAT where the job becomes a bit more managerial, a bit more about sitting around in meetings and less around going out talking to people and writing analytical cables and things. The Lowy Institute, what was really then Australia's first kind of foreign policy think tank, and it was an opportunity to be at the ground floor at something new, something different. And so I was part of the original team there, and I set up the Middle East program there, and then for the last 5 years at Lowy, I became the research director, and so responsible for the kind of the quality and the direction of all the research the institute produced.
And it's such an important organisation, right?
It is.
And
it is.
That it's got that wonderful sort of sandstone building sort of in the middle of the city. It's now sort of become a beacon of real thought in this space, right? And we're lucky the Lowy family supported it.
No, very lucky, and it was great to be on that kind of journey. It's fair to say that none of us that worked at the institute ever worked in a think tank before. We didn't really know what we were doing, but I think it's a testament to the commitment and the patience of the Lowy family, and Frank Lowy in particular, to let us find our feet and find a way. And most of us, there were some experienced hands there, of course, the late Alan Gingell, who was our first executive director, but all the researchers, including the current executive director Michael Fulilov, we were all pretty unknown. And they gave us the space and the resources and the support to find our way. And everyone looks at the Lowy Institute today and thinks, it was always like that. But
no, you
at the
built from
beginning,
ground up, right?
Yeah.
Well, I remember your speech was very good and was very well received that evening. So whatever it was you spoke about, it was well regarded.
And then did a few other things, and then now I found myself at the Asia Society.
And you're the chief executive for Australia, is that correct?
So Asia Society is a global organisation. Obviously, has an American heritage. It was established in the 1950s by Rockefeller's grandson, who had an interest in Asia. And it started with that educational, cultural focus, and then over the years, it's accreted really these other, elements: business, politics, policy, research, and has also developed now. There are 16 centres around the world, a number in the US, a few in Europe, but we're strong in Asia, including here in Australia. We're in India, Japan, Korea. Hong Kong, the Philippines.
I went to your Hong Kong facility, which is beautiful.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's extraordinary,
it's amazing.
right?
I was up there a few weeks ago and had a bad case of building envy.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's about time we had an Australian version of it. I think.
Indeed.
Perhaps we can get a benefactor.
Kind of wealthy philanthropists out there looking to build a building for someone. I'll leave you my number at the end of this.
There you go.
podcast.
You heard it here first.
Yeah.
So the thing I love about the Asia Society is its Asian reach. Actually, I remember traveling across Asia with a Premier, Barry O'Farrell, when he had just become elected, and he gave an Asia Society speech in Hong Kong, he gave one in China, he gave one in India, and it was just a great forum to get the business community together, and also the broader sort of community around a unifying theme. And you've run a number of very interesting fora here in Australia. I know you had a big conference recently as well, where really putting the whole Australia-China relationship on the map, which I think has been particularly helpful, and particularly helpful now, given the sort of great changes that are happening in geopolitics. But before I get into that, I wanted to ask you about Australia's relationship with Asia. So I've been here, 27 years or something like that. All these sort of stories that as a new migrant you hear at university. And I've always felt that we've had a sort of uncomfortable relationship with Asia, that we are economically dependent on a relationship with Asia, but somehow we have some level of, I suppose, a lack of confidence in how we relate to them. Do you think that's true?
I wouldn't necessarily a lack of confidence. The thing that struck me, and I've been in this job for 18 months now, the thing that struck me and, frankly alarmed me a bit is I think there's still large parts of Australian society and Australian business that have a lack of interest. In Asia, which is striking given the economic opportunities there. And look on the face of it, Australia economically has done very well in Asia. I think it's 8 of our top 10 markets are there. China is a huge market for us, huge proportion of our resources. We've got free trade agreements all over the region. But I think, you scratch below the surface a little bit, and I think there's a fragility there. And, the fact that we're so dependent on one or two big markets in the region. We're so dependent on a few commodities. Yes, there are companies that have put in the hard yards, educated themselves about Asia, developed good partnerships in the region. But I'd say still the majority of the business community is more comfortable doing business in Europe and the US than in Asia. The very fact that the government felt it necessary to articulate and develop a Southeast Asia strategy after so many years and successive governments are talking about the importance of Asia is telling.
Yeah, we don't have an American strategy, do we?
No, but the fact that they felt it was necessary reflected a concern, and I think it's correct that we are underweight in Southeast Asia, which is, Southeast Asia has its challenges, but it's clearly a rapidly growing economically, enormous opportunity. Yet we invest more in New Zealand than we do in Southeast Asia. Yeah. So I think that's the problem. Look, the confidence question, I think there was an unfortunate, in that kind of whole Hansen era, there was this question about whether Australia was an Asian nation. And it almost became a question of ethnicity, right? Are we Asian? And I think, understandably, many Australians of different ethnic origins says, well, I'm not Asian. I think the better framing of that question was, well, are we part of Asia? Right? Which is a different question to saying, are we Asian or not? And I feel that kind of conversation went down the are we Asian track rather than focusing on are we part of Asia, geographically, yes, and then posing the challenge to ourselves, which is, well, if we are part of Asia, how connected are we? How much connective tissue do we have into the region? And as I said earlier, yes, with China, there is an enormous economic relationship, but also a massive reliance on a single market, a few commodities. But there are still big holes in if you look at the map of Asia, there are still areas where we're clearly underweight. I mean, India, how long have we been talking about India as a great opportunity?
Extraordinary.
But it's still a relationship that is making progress, but economically, you still get that sense it hasn't reached anywhere near its kind of potential.
Yeah, I do feel part of it is a patience thing. I just got back from Tokyo where we had a very large Australia-Japan Business Cooperation Conference, a very large conference. And it wasn't always large because it was always focused on resources, right? Now it's focused on real estate, it's focused on infrastructure and so on. And a number of people I was speaking to there, made the remark that the Japanese are wonderful investors in Australia. And in fact, we looked at a chart that had Japan as the number one real estate investor at the moment in Australia, followed by Singapore and Hong Kong, so 3 Asian nations. But the comment was, Australians lack patience when dealing with our companies, with dealing with us. They want us to act immediately. It's almost this very American, or perhaps the perception of what an American style of business is doing like. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
That's the thing, when I've asked that question over the last 18 months, well, why is it that we're underweight in Asia? The things that come up often are, we're a bit risk averse, including compared to some of our many of our competitors. We're very short-term focused. There's a disconnect between our business culture and business cultures in different parts of Asia. Not to say there's one uniform culture, but different cultures. So it certainly echoes what you were saying. And there's a lot of talk at the moment about Asia literacy, for example. And I think we do have an Asia literacy crisis. We seem to understand Asia in this country as a whole less than we did 20 years ago. But I don't think the focus seems to be on, well, we need to get our kids learning Asian languages again. But I actually think that's important, but it's actually more about how do you make companies literate about how you operate in a business context in Asia, and the differences in business cultures and the differences in approach to risk and regulation and those things. That for me is, in many ways, a more important literacy for the country. It's great to have, in the halcyon days of Asia literacy and Asia education in the 80s and 90s, we still only produced a kind of a core number of Asia experts. The focus today should be, yes, we should have those Asia experts, but we need to build around them Asia expertise that spreads across our companies. And I think that goes at every level. We're doing a lot with early mid-career professionals, trying to train the new cohort of Asia literate professionals. And we're not teaching them languages, we're trying to teach them thematic topics in an Asian context. How are startups done in Asia? What does the energy transition in Asia look like? Those kinds of things. I think there's also work to be done at board level, where I think this whole question of the literacy of boards. And I think that there's a bit of more work that in that kind of Asia engagement space, and there are lots of kind of players that have been doing good work over many years. My observation there over the last 18 months is that it just seems to be a lot of preaching to the converted. The people that turn up to these kind of conferences and meetings are already on board. And what's the effort to reach out to the unconverted, right? Companies that should be looking at Asia, or were looking at Asia, or looked at Asia 10 years ago and said, well, that's too hard, and they haven't looked again. I think there's also that element of we lack a contemporary understanding of Asia. Companies looked at Indonesia 10 years ago and said, oh, it's too hard, and have assumed that Indonesia hasn't changed much over the last 10 years, when we know Indonesia and parts of Southeast Asia, with all the challenges of operating there, have changed dramatically.
As have we. We've changed, right? So
the final thing I'd say on that is, we make a big deal of talking about what we say is our natural advantage here, that the large proportion of Australians are of Asian heritage. And it is completely an advantage, but I think we've done bugger all to utilise that advantage. I think, and that's partly because it's hard. It's partly how do you work out, how do you partner with Asian Australian communities to build those connections. There are practical questions around, commercial in confidence. Do people have the time? All that kind of stuff. But I think, we've said that a lot, but I think we've done very little to actually use that advantage. And that's also an area where Asia Society, where we're trying to do some work. We're trying to knuckle down and work out, okay, practically, how does this work in the context, for example, of the Southeast Asia strategy? How does having, Australians of Southeast Asian heritage who are, business leaders in their field, who have a deep understanding of how you operate in those markets, how do you share their knowledge, their expertise, their insights, their networks with the broader business community in a practical way?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I find with that is within large corporates, you almost have to have an advocate for a particular country. So I think part of the problem with this Asia thing is it's not a single country. It's a continent of very different countries, right? And so when we think of America, America is extremely different, but it is a unified country, under one government. That is not Asia. It's not Europe for that matter either, but it's not Asia. And so in a large corporate, when you're dealing with business in Asia, you have to have an advocate for each country. So, we're being hosted here by Lendlease. Lendlease had an Asia business that had multiple countries, and it had a country head in each one. Each one had a localized view of how to work and do business in those countries, right? I'm a huge advocate for that. I think within a corporate setting, if you want to have an Asia strategy, you want to have an Asian country strategy, you need to have a localized understanding of the market you're trying to be part of. And I don't think that's necessarily a controversial statement. I think that's just a reality of doing business anywhere, right?
But you know what, Jason, the clock is ticking on this, right? So for decades, we've talked about Australia's economic opportunity and economic destiny in Asia, right, for decades. Well, the rest of the world have cottoned on to that now. And opportunities for, market opportunities for capital are finite. And the irony would be, wouldn't it be ironic if some of our competitors, including countries that are our allies, the United States, whose companies are less risk averse, who are more interested in long term, if they were able to beat us and we were the last dog of the bowl? That would be not just an irony, but be a tragedy. And, it's not just we've got to get out of our head that, we're engaging in Asia to be friends with Asia or out of some altruistic reason. All of our national interest points to you have to have strong, resilient, diversified economic relationships with what is the world's most important region economically. And, those other markets, yes, the US is still important, Europe is still important, but these are mature markets, right? The future is in Asia, and it would be awful to think that after decades of governments and experts and countless reports, we end up at the end of the line.
I think that's right. And I think, again, it goes back to this patience question. I mean, I look at how in my own career now dealing with Asia for a long time in terms of Asian companies investing in Australia. I keep going back to the word trust and the word patience. Those are the two things. Like you don't win the trust of anybody without spending time with them and without going to their home market and spending time with them and their boards and their executives and their families often, right, to get an understanding of who you are and what you're representing. Then you get to talk about the project you want them to invest in or the opportunity you want to invest in. And even then it takes a long period of time. And so I think for us as a country, that's something we've got to learn. If we're going to become the sort of country that I think we can be with a strong and interrelated and interwoven relationship with Asia, we have to treat each country on its own in its own rights.
I agree,
right?
But I think it's also a mindset. It's a mindset challenge. Like every international economic opportunity investment is always going to be as you know, is going to be a combination of risk and opportunity, right? But it just seems that those kind of countries and cultures that we're most familiar with, we start with the opportunity. And then we go, okay, well, that's a massive, the US, that's a great opportunity. And then we'll deal with the risk element. It just seems that, particularly in the case of Southeast Asia, many of our kind of businesses that aren't experienced in the region just see the risk and they don't get to the opportunity.
Yeah, I know Indonesia's doing a pretty...
We've got to flip that mindset. It's got to be, okay, yes, there are risks and there are challenges and you've got to operate in a different way, but let's start with the opportunity first and then get to the...
And I think part of it as well is if there are risks, you need to explain to the government what those risks are and say, look, we would love to invest in your market, but there are these problems, right? And I think Indonesia is doing that at the moment. We've got a new president coming in Indonesia. They've done a range of conferences. There are business events. They're sending out ministers. They want to understand what is stopping Australian investment into Indonesia. And I know I looked myself in Indonesia. One of the big challenges was finding a good joint venture partner. Very challenging in the Indonesian market. You're required to have a joint venture partner, and the law requires you to do that because they don't want a 100% foreign-owned entity in infrastructure in particular, but also real estate. And then you add on top of that, sort of the murky understanding of regulation and, how does it all work in terms of the law? How do where are the risks of getting into trouble? And boards go, well, here's this risk register, and there's crosses all across it, right? So that stops an investment. So that's a good segue though into the sort of world we're living in now. So we are obviously post-US election. It's an emphatic victory for the Trump administration, incoming administration. At this point, I think they've got all three tiers of government. They've got the presidency, the Senate, and I think probably the House of Representatives.
I think it's settled, but I think, it's close.
It might be close if it's not already settled. So that's an amazing opportunity for an incoming administration. There's at least 2 years to get things done. So for the purpose of this conversation, I think what's really interesting is what he wants to do on trade. So he calls it an America First strategy. His narrative has long been that America is taken advantage of in the global trade environment. Trump administration one saw a recut of NAFTA, which everyone thought was outrageous, but actually benefited, I think, the agreement. There was a lot of discussion about how China was trading with the US and the world. What are we expecting now in Trump 2? Is it a continuation of that, or is this a threat to make the Chinese do something different, or others? What do you think?
The first thing, look, my general approach with the Trump administration, kind of two kind of interrelated points as a general observation. Yeah. The first is,
I presume you've deleted your tweets, by the way, or
I'm not on Twitter. So
sorry, it's an inside joke from
The first thing is, at the moment, we are literally walking through the valley of hot takes, like Trump's going to do this, Trump's going to do that.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it doesn't matter whether it's Trump or any new president. Most of those hot takes end up being wrong, right? Because it's early days, and it's a presidency is not just what the president wants to do. It's also the interaction between what the president wants to do and the global environment, the world that confronts them, and the events that confront them, right? So we have to discount a lot of the analysis at the moment, including potentially my own, right? So there's a good qualifier.
It's a disclaimer.
But I think it's really important. And it relates to the second point, is particularly with Trump, we have to resist the temptation to set our hair on fire, right? It's because there is so much loaded up around his personality and perceptions of who he is, and not just the less attractive parts of his personality, but also the fact that he clearly is mercurial and
he's a showman.
Volatile,
he's a showman.
That there's that oh my God, the world's going to go up in flames, or it's going to be so. I think we should be kind of cautious with those caveats in place. I would say we should take him at his word, right? So, as you rightly said, he has been elected with the mandate of putting America first, and he will do that. Now, I've got to say, that's not a massive break from previous presidents. The president's job is always to put America first.
Well, our Prime Minister's job is to put our country first.
Right, exactly.
Prime Minister of New Zealand's job, right?
So what he's doing, he's going to do it in a way that is very different and disruptive of the way it's been done in the past. That being said, it's not like suddenly Trump's been elected and the globalised economic order that we've all benefited from has ended. That process has already started. We are clearly, even before Trump won, we were moving away from a global economic environment where the main framework was globalisation, where the main driver was what's the economic logic, right? What's the economic logic of where you put your factories? Even before Trump, okay, and driven primarily by concerns in the US government, but also in the business community about the trajectory of Chinese foreign policy and Chinese power, there was already an impetus to have national security be, if not certainly a major determinant of how the world trades and how economic activity is conducted.
That like-minded companies are starting to group
So,
together, right?
industry policy, not being so reliant on particular supply chains or countries, supply chain diversity.
The just-in-case supply chain. Right?
Exactly. The willingness to share technology and ideas and research, that openness that marked globalization, that was already in question before Trump won. And if there is a line, a consistent line that goes through the first Trump administration to the Biden administration, and that will continue in the third Biden administration, it's that. We are now we're not in a deglobalized world because it's harder than the kind of the strategists that want to kind of change the way we do business globally. It's harder to move away from that world, right? The economic logic will still dictate a lot of things. But we are clearly in the world where we are back talking about tariffs, industry policy, protectionism, trading with your friends, not trading with others. The question is, can you actually make that happen? So Trump is operating that in that environment. Now, the question of, he's talked about, imposing a 60% tariff on China, and he may well do that in his first day. But the question we have there is that a negotiating tactic, or is it this is a way to kind of protect American industry? What does it mean for other kind of trading partners? I mean, it's clear he will be more transactional. But again, I would say it's not like previous US presidents weren't transactional. Previous US presidents looked after US interests. There is a reason why America, and it's had nothing to do with Trump, found it incapable to engage in free trade agreements in Asia, because in Congress, across the board politically, there was a loss of support because of that perception that globalization had robbed many Americans of jobs and livelihoods. So, Trump is in many ways a symptom of that, and he will be a disruptor, and that he clearly wants to pursue different policies. And I think our response to that has to be, we have to look at every policy on its merits. We can't just focus on Trump the man and think, oh my God, he's crazy, or he's not up to this job. We just have to deal.
Which is what a lot of the media commentary is, right?
Exactly. We have to be patient.
And that's very shallow thinking.
We have to be patient, and we have to deal with because as you rightly said, there were some good things that came out of the first Trump administration that changed things for the better. And so we've got to take it at that. And like I said, not set our hair on fire thinking, the world's going to end and we'll have to move to Tasmania, right? So
many people do want to move to Tasmania.
Yeah.
True. But I would reflect on it, on the tariff question. I think, when we first looked at tariffs, or when we were young, tariffs were a protection mechanism, right? It was we have to protect our clothing industry and textiles industry. We have to protect our car industry. I almost hear Trump, when he speaks about this, President-elect Trump, I suppose we should say, in saying, well, actually, I'm charging you to enter my market. I am the biggest market. You want my consumers. And if you want American consumers, you have to pay for it. You can't just dump your product in here at a low price and and get in here. So I think he's almost flipping what.
The problem is, Jason, it's very likely that the person who's going to pay for that are the American consumers.
Well, I know, but the narrative is attractive, right? And the narrative is attractive to American consumers. Like there's a whole body of experts that say, well, if you raise tariffs on Chinese goods, it's inflationary in the US, right? There is some truth to that. It just depends on how you apply these tariffs. If it is a negotiating tactic, and you're saying, okay, China, you can access my market, but you've got to produce more in my market, in my country, which again is not a new policy. I mean, we saw this with Japanese car makers producing cars in America. The only reason why that happened is because the American government demanded it. It's not because the Japanese thought it'd be really good to produce cars in America or anywhere else. They would have probably picked somewhere else, right? So I think that narrative is quite interesting. And the other point I'd reflect on in what you've just said is this grouping of interests in like-minded countries. Would you agree that the Quad and AUKUS and sort of bodies like that are the beginnings of that? I mean, I look at the Quad. There seems to be an economic narrative behind what was sort of a governmental agreement. It was a sort of foreign ministers meeting, I think, that has now been elevated to that of a leaders meeting, and it now seems to have a growing economic component to it. Am I misreading that?
No. I would put it slightly a different way. I think clearly the emphasis of the Quad was strategic, And I think now the challenge is to try and you know, to add other components to including the economic component to build it out. I think that the challenge for the Quad is that the Quad contains 3 countries that are very used to working with each other strategically and economically, right? Japan, the United States and Australia. But it contains a 4th country that has not been a traditional partner of the other 3, which is India. And, you know, clearly the way India is positioning itself strategically, it's not like it's kind of, it's very much a hedging power. It's kind of moved beyond the non-aligned bit, but it's not kind of like, it's not moved from non-aligned into one or the other camp. It's still hedging. It's a member of the BRICS. So
has a new currency, the BRICS.
Exactly, and it doesn't. So that doesn't mean that the Quad won't succeed, but it does mean that and the Quad has made progress, and certainly the strategic relationship between the US and India, and, you know, and to lesser degrees Japan and Australia and India has developed, but it doesn't have you know, for example, with AUKUS, it doesn't have that great weight and history of engagement to kind of build on. So AUKUS is a more natural fit because you know, it's part of, you know, it's within the Five Eyes. You've long had very established, very well practiced, very deep, you know, strategic and economic relationships between the 3 countries that are partners. So in that sense, you know, the main challenge to AUKUS is pulling off this what is basically the equivalent of a magic trick, which is, you know, how do you and a very expensive magic trick, how do you transfer this very sensitive and difficult to manage technology to Australia? But in many ways, I think it's got more challenges because there's something very tangible about it, and it's building on a long history of close cooperations. I think the Quad thing is still trying to work out what it wants to be, and so that's why I think, you know, people are adding in, you know, economic and climate change elements, and I don't think it's got that, certainly hasn't got that ballast yet.
So the Trump and Modi administrations have famously, or Trump and Modi rather, at a personal level, appear to have a good relationship. What would a Trump administration look to do with a vehicle like that, the Quad? Like, I know that's a highly speculative question, and, you know, who knows, but...
Look, it's a hard question to answer because, you know, at its core, the Quad is basically a response to the perception that China is seeking a strategic hegemony in the region. Certainly, what we've seen from the administration's appointments so far is a number of individuals that are very hardline on China, both economically and strategically. It's just a question of how Trump and the administration are going to pursue this kind of competition with China. Because, you know, one way would simply be to make America stronger, to make America, you know, to force its allies kind of to pick up more of the slack, and in a sense, and you've got that kind of area of tension where the Trump and certainly the America First idea is a bit. There's the elements that are a bit leery of foreign entanglements. You remember that the America First, I think, partly grew out of those decades of war on terror in Iraq, and many American communities who lost sons and daughters, or whose sons and daughters came back to those communities with very serious injuries and traumas from those conflicts. So, for example, this whole question of what would happen, what would a Trump administration do in the case of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan? So, my point there is, even if the Trump administration, as it appears to be, wants to compete with China, how it competes might end up being very different, and that will answer the question of what's the Quad for.
Fascinating. I think that's right. I mean, if you look at the language of what's coming out of the Trump administration in transition, this line, peace through strength, is being repeated over and over and over again, which is it's a deterrence. I'm a deterrence now, right? It's not going to be if you cross the line, it's back to Trump 1 fire and fury, I suppose, right? Which who would have thought? Like, you imagine the fire and fury thing happened, then he went and actually visited North Korea and shook the dictator's hand. It's fascinating.
There's this strange thing in the Trump it seems to be in the Trump worldview, that you want to build up your military, you want to appear strong, but that doesn't necessarily mean you use your military as much as previous administrations have. So, famously in his first administration, people point to the fact that, he killed Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard called Quds Force, right? A very famous figure. But what he also famously didn't do was the Iranians launched a massive strike on Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure, to which the Trump administration essentially didn't respond militarily.
So fair enough, that's payment for Soleimani, right?
Well, no, that was before Soleimani. There was always a reluctance also to use kind of military power, and I think part of that stems from that America First kind of reaction against those decades under both previous Republican and Democratic administrations, where it was felt America was too deeply entangled in these foreign conflicts and in the rest of the world, and it's reflected also in the Trump demand that allies pay more and do more, so
I think there's some truth to that. Like, I think I remember that famous picture when he's sitting at the table and Angela Merkel is sort of appears to be berating him. But on NATO, it was true that many of those countries were paying well below their defence requirements, and Jens Stoltenberg famously said it in his, was he Dutch? I think he might be. I can't remember where he's from, but he has a pronounced accent, and he said, this is the Trump administration is the reason why NATO is getting more funding from European partners. And it's like, wow.
I think the reason they're funding now is more to do with Russia than they were to do with Trump. I think the Europeans now understand that they are, dealing with a very live threat in the case of Russia. And obviously, Ukraine's going to be a very, very interesting play out. How the Trump administration handles that, and the fears that Trump will force the Ukrainians into a.
So he's going to cut a deal
into a quick peace.
Yeah. What do you think? What will happen then? What are your thoughts?
It's very hard to say because, on the one hand, it's clear that many people around Trump do not want the US to continue endlessly funding at fairly high levels a war that seems to be basically in a stalemate. Yeah. There are even some, I think, pockets of people that have this kind of quiet admiration for Putin.
Really?
Yeah, I think there is this kind of, because he's there's those parts that particularly the strong anti-woke parts of the kind of Trump support base that see that like Putin because he is himself the ultimate anti-woke and he's traditional and
destroying his country, starving his people, and his sons.
The challenge for Trump will be: is there a deal to be done? And that will depend. And this is what the point I made earlier about on the one hand, it's what does Trump want? What does President Trump want to do? On the other hand, it's how does the world respond? So he can say, as he has, I want a deal. I want to strike a deal on Ukraine.
But you need to have two willing parties.
But what if, exactly? And really, it depends on, is Putin prepared to play a ball, and on what terms?
What is in this? What is in it for Putin in this current arrangement? Given that the war has clearly failed.
It's clearly failed, but he has an opportunity. I think he'll see an opportunity with Trump to sue for peace on favourable terms to him. In other words, so
he gets out of it saving face.
Preserve. Well, more than saving face. I mean, he's still in possession of large portions of Ukrainian territory, and he has the ability to preserve that and to stop, the constant bleed that the Ukrainian war is for Russia. Now, Russia's in many ways, economically, it's put itself on a war footing, right? And it's doing, okay. But the cost in terms of, human lives and military material has been enormous. So
I heard a report they're running out of vehicles.
Yeah. Right? I mean, they're kind of like, I even saw a report the other day saying that they went to some Russian movie company to kind of ask them to borrow their, World War One or World War Two kind of tanks so they can use it. So I don't know if it's true or not, but it's clear. It clearly is having a material impact.
And even this discussion now of North Korean troops arriving in Russia to go onto the front line.
Well, the fact that Iranians are making drones for Russia to use. So I think he'll see the opportunity to, at the very least, preserve the gains, sue for peace on favourable terms, impose some more conditions on Ukraine, like, making sure that Ukraine doesn't join NATO, all those kinds of things. The question is, how far does he push it? How far does he push his luck? And how patient will Trump be with that? In the end, will he say, no, look, they're the deal and take it or leave it? So that's one element to it. I mean, the Ukrainians have a say, obviously, but obviously they're in a difficult position because if Trump has much more leverage over Ukraine than he has over Russia, in the sense that he can just cut off arms supplies to Ukraine, and then
the war is over, pretty much.
It's not over, but the Europeans can pick up a bit of the slack, but
they can't pick it all.
They can't pick it all up.
There's a pretty significant support base from
So I think that will be one to watch. Now, having said that, the thing that Trump will want to avoid is appearing to be the loser in any deal. That Trump is pinned with the blame for losing Ukraine.
It's a weakness. That would be a weak position.
Yeah. So that somehow, a bit like Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan. That if this deal sees, a total collapse of Ukraine, or sees the Russian, for example, if the Russians, agree terms, and then as soon as the terms agree, they take more territory, or they are not seen to abide by the agreement. If it presents him as weak, I think that's something he'll want to avoid, and that's why I'm saying a lot of it's going to depend on that dynamic between him and Putin. Is Putin going to push his luck too far? Is he going to feel that he can get more favourable terms if he holds out? And that will determine how all this plays out, rather than just Trump saying, "Okay, I'm going to settle this in a day."
Isn't it fascinating how these sorts of things often rely around a few personalities, right?
Yeah, I actually, there's the two broad competing schools of thought about history: the great man or the great woman theory, or the forces of history. Which are the things that most determine what happens in the world, what happens in history? And I'm actually more in the camp of the forces of history, because I think things happen because of the interaction between what individuals, what governments, what others do, how others respond, accidents, coincidence, all those things, which I would, if I had to kind of put my kind of, if I put my money anywhere, it's more, events and the kind of the arc and the direction of history that determines what happens, rather than individuals. Individuals clearly play an important role, but on their own, no one is that powerful that they get everything that they want.
So I want to get to China in a second. Before I do, given we're on a war footing, Israel and Hamas.
Yeah.
Where are we at? What's going to happen?
Crystal
ball. I
fear nothing good. Look, when we're talking about Gaza and the West Bank, clearly Israel has very, very significantly degraded Hamas's capabilities. Are they destroyed as an organisation? Time will tell, but this has been an enormous blow to Hamas. At the same time, in the same process, there has been enormous damage there's been enormous human costs, civilians and the civil infrastructure. And even though that conflict's ongoing, it seems pretty clear that there isn't much more that the Israelis can gain militarily from what they're doing. So the focus now will be on setting the terms for what happens in Gaza beyond that. And, from what we're seeing in the news and what's being reported, it does seem, the Israelis are putting in place a military architecture, which means, some parts of Gaza, they will never allow people to come back into.
Something that will stop another October 7.
October 7. but big question marks, huge numbers of Gazans are now without homes, without livelihoods. How is that all run? Aid levels are dropping. It is a human catastrophe of the first order.
Terrible.
And how that's dealt with. I think there is also the likelihood that particularly the more right-wing members of Netanyahu's coalition will see in Trump the opportunity to go even further in taking steps that the international community would find very, very difficult to kind of respond to. People are talking about, annexation of large parts of the West Bank, things like that. So, that's also going to be a difficult relationship for Trump to kind of manage. But I also think to restrain those elements that see this kind of opportunity to really double down on what's seen as a great Israeli victory, including in Lebanon, where they wiped out a significant part of Hezbollah's leadership. There's always that likelihood that they want to press too far, and that will also then create responses in the international community. I mean, you're talking about our own region. What's happened in Gaza is a very live issue in Indonesia, in Malaysia,
and Thailand.
That is and Thailand.
And here.
That is all, and here.
Yeah.
That is already, certainly in Southeast Asia, made the relationship between the US and those Southeast Asian countries more difficult, more tricky. If the Israeli government uses what they see as even more license under a Trump administration to do things that are more outrageous, then the cost to the US in terms of their relationships in other parts of the Muslim world will be higher. And here too, like Trump, I think still has this ambition of forging that deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I think
that started with that Abraham Accords.
Yeah, and I think if the Netanyahu government pushes again, like a bit like Putin, if they push their luck, they push too far, they do things that make it impossible. It'll be frustrating for Trump as well, because he'll be saying, "No, we want to." And I thought it was quite interesting, when in the first few months, and it might have been an electoral ploy when Trump said, "Look, the Israelis need to get this done, and soon, rather than prolonging the war."
Yeah.
So,
that didn't happen, really.
No, it didn't,
Yeah.
and he is in that sense very transactional. I mean, he is someone that, for countries and for relationships that have been built on, tradition and shared values and loyalty, that's a challenge. But it's also a challenge for countries where they think, okay, well, we've gotten on well with Trump in the past. He's transactional, he is mercurial, and he can change.
Interesting. So I'm conscious we're going to run out of time. I do want to get to China, because I think that's an important discussion for us to have. So obviously we've reflected on a bunch of things with the Trump administration. We've talked about tariffs, but China itself is not in the position it was in Trump 1. Trump 2, China's economy has gone under some strain, a lot of strain. There's been a significant deleveraging of the property sector in China. We've seen that actually in the Australian property sector, as a number of projects have sort of changed hands as Chinese developers leave this market. There are still a lot of, impacts of COVID from China that are going through. We had Wayne Porrett on this podcast talking about the impact on Hong Kong. How does a weakened China now deal with this environment? What is the pathway forward for China?
So, I think we need another podcast to answer the question.
We might have to have you back. And just an hour long is not enough.
And look, and I'm not an expert on China. And I'm certainly not an expert on the Chinese economy. I mean, the observations I make are things that people who do observe the Chinese economy more closely than I do, and that seem to make sense to me. I mean, one is clearly the Chinese economy is at a different stage, and they're dealing with the challenges. Leaving aside the political question for a moment of Xi and the way that he clearly wants to run China, or is running China, which is different from his predecessors. Leave that to one side. So if we look at just in the context of economically, even if Xi was a different president, I think China would be facing many of these problems. Clearly, for example, in property, we're seeing a hangover of that COVID period where there was this injection of money.
Huge stimulus packages.
Huge stimulus packages are now, you've got the sugar hit now, but now you're paying the bill, right? Now you've got to do the exercise.
I've always wanted to go to an empty Chinese city. That's something.
Indeed.
There's some near Inner Mongolia,
Right,
but I just think that would be an amazing experience.
So that's one challenge. And clearly they have to work their way through it. Having said that, even if the economy slows, just the sheer size and the productive capacity and, the ability, if they can pull it off, to go from being an economy that was primarily outward focused to an economy that is kind of focusing on
its consumers are consuming.
Consuming.
That changes the game, right?
That it clearly has that kind of potential, and so I think that's clearly something to watch. The interesting question is how China is run, and she has come in where, it's not to say that economics is not important, but the politics control China's place in the world and status have now become more important than they used to be in the past as drivers of policy, to the point where some people argue, well, the old argument used to be that the key goal of the Communist Party of China was to make sure the economy kept growing to keep people happy, and that's how they preserve loyalty, right? Now it's, they're less concerned about that, but the way to win loyalty is to emphasise kind of Chinese nationalism and the position of China in the world, and clearly that has become alongside the effort to exercise much more direct control over society, to close down those areas where it was possible to people to be speak more freely and to criticise, control nationalism, asserting China's place, building up the military. That's clearly a priority for them. So in that sense, that will continue. The interesting question, I think, is does she fear Trump, or does he see Trump as an opportunity? And I think there's a little bit of both. I think they do fear the mercurial nature of Trump and some of the piece through strength, and that he's hard to kind of pin down. But I also think they see an opportunity, because in Trump's transactional approach, and particularly the kind of protectionist approach, there is an opportunity. There is an opportunity to bring other countries, particularly in Asia, closer to China, in the sense that if the US is closing its market, not just to China, but to kind of Southeast Asian countries, if the US is appearing like, the US in previous administrations have talked about China as a challenge to the established rules-based order. But if America is now breaking the rules, China can present itself as a more stable, the more stable kind of player. Yeah. There is in all superpower contests in the Cold War, there is a heart and mind battle going on, and I think she and the CCP will see the opportunities to win more hearts and minds as some of the harder edges and more transactional approach that Trump, if he pursues it to its full, they'll see opportunities to kind of pull people closer.
Do you think Australia has a brokering sort of role
No.
between China and Australia?
No. I don't. I think. I don't, and it's not. I don't think it's. I don't think it's in our interest. I don't think it's in our capability. We have important relationships with both countries, but
we should let them sort their relationship out.
We should let them sort their relationship out. I think we do have a role to play where, it's in nobody's interest that there's a trade war. So we do have a role to play as an advocate for, recognising that the world has changed and it's not just a globalised world anymore. But, Australia benefits from an open international trading order, for being an advocate as far as possible for that, and for preserving at least bits of that, because we benefit when the global trading order is more open as a trading nation and as a small domestic market. So we have a role there, but I don't think, even if we wanted to, I don't think we could, be on the line between Washington and Beijing saying, Trump says this, she says this, and trying to kind of,
We
patch
can't play
things up.
the role of the Swiss, right?
No.
That's what you're saying.
Well, I'm not sure the Swiss ever
The
played.
Swiss never played that
The
role.
Swiss never played that role. It was just their territory played their role. It was
Yeah.
somewhere for people to come and
Was
talk. So, the key thing, again, in both relationships is the government has to have a very strong, keen sense of what's the national interest here. And it's interesting, I was thinking about it this morning, as part of the effort to stabilise the relationship with China, the Albanese government has kind of articulated this approach of, agree where we can, disagree where we must, and always do things in the national interest. I actually think it's not a bad approach to Trump as well. Now, the difference being that I think with the US, we'll agree on a lot more. But I think that those other caveats are also important. We have to, where we need to disagree, we should disagree, and we have to have a keen sense of the national interest. And this is what concerns me a bit now about a lot of the debate around, how are we going to kind of develop a good relationship with Trump? And should Rudd go or not go? I mean, I think it's in the end, our relationship with the US is underpinned by shared history and shared values, but also it is a means to an end, and that end being our security and prosperity. And we have to have a keen sense and be absolutely ruthless in pursuit of that. So, yes, towards that end, it's good to have a strong relationship with every US administration and find ways, to get in the diary of any US president, because you're always in a competition, right? You find any angle or any advantage you have, to get from that relationship what you want. But we can't turn ourselves now inside and out and become this kind of craven, or what are we going to do to make Trump love us?
Yeah.
The US-American relationship has a long history, shared values, but also it is more than just the occupant of the White House. There are enormous numbers of relationships and people who work on a daily basis on that relationship, which is in many ways has become kind of deeper. So it kind of doesn't really matter who's in the White House, nor in fact who the Australian ambassador is. And I think I worry in the current conversation we're losing sight of that a bit.
Well, it's going to be a fascinating period of time ahead. This has been a fascinating conversation. I do hope you'll come back, because I agree with you. I think we could do another 3 or 4 hours on this stuff. But it's been a real pleasure having you on. Anthony Bubalo, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.